He thought the badge made him untouchable, until the moment it didn't. The courtroom felt colder than it should have for a mild spring morning in downtown Chicago, the kind of cold that didn't come from air conditioning, but from tension hanging thick between polished wooden benches and the high ceiling lights that hummed softly above. People shifted in their seats, some pretending to scroll through their phones, others watching too closely, as if they already knew something was about to go wrong but didn't want to be the first to admit it. At the center of it all stood Officer Daniel Brooks, tall, rigid, his uniform pressed sharp enough to reflect the sterile light, his presence loud even in silence, the kind of man who had spent years believing that authority wasn't just something he carried, but something he owned. A few feet away stood Angela Carter, calm, composed, her posture straight but not defensive, dressed simply in a dark blazer and neutral tones that made her almost blend into the background, almost invisible to anyone who wasn't really looking. And that was exactly the problem. Because Daniel wasn't really looking. To him, she was just another interruption, another inconvenience in a system that usually bent in his favor. The judge had not yet entered, the room suspended in that strange in-between moment where rules felt loose and power felt unchecked, and Daniel took full advantage of it. His voice cut through the quiet, sharp and dismissive, drawing a few uneasy glances but no real intervention. Angela didn't respond. She didn't argue, didn't raise her voice, didn't step back. She simply stood there, her eyes steady, locked onto his with a stillness that didn't match the situation, a stillness that felt deliberate. For a brief second, something flickered across Daniel's face, something uncertain, but it vanished just as quickly as it came, replaced by the same confidence he had worn like armor for years. Around them, whispers began to ripple, soft, cautious, as if the room itself was holding its breath. A clerk near the front adjusted a stack of files, glancing up longer than necessary. A man in the back row leaned forward, elbows on his knees, eyes narrowing. And still, Angela said nothing. She simply adjusted the sleeve of her blazer, a small, controlled movement, and let the silence stretch just long enough to become uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that made people shift in their seats, the kind that made even the most confident person feel, for just a moment, like they might be missing something important. Daniel scoffed under his breath, shaking his head as if dismissing the moment entirely, but his stance shifted ever so slightly, his weight no longer evenly planted. He didn't notice the way the courtroom door at the side creaked open just a fraction. He didn't notice the subtle change in posture from a senior officer near the wall. He didn't notice the way the air itself seemed to tighten, like the seconds before a storm finally breaks. But Angela noticed. And for the first time, the faintest hint of something appeared in her expression. Not anger, not fear, something quieter, something certain. And if anyone had been watching closely enough, they would have realized in that moment that this wasn't a confrontation. It was a setup. The silence did not break all at once. It shifted, slowly, like a room adjusting to a truth it had not yet fully understood. And somewhere near the back, a chair scraped softly against the floor, too loud for the stillness, drawing just enough attention for a few heads to turn before quickly looking away again. Because no one wanted to be the first to acknowledge that something had changed, not officially, not yet, and Daniel Brooks, still standing with that same rigid confidence, exhaled sharply through his nose as if dismissing the entire moment. But the rhythm of his breathing had changed, just slightly, just enough to betray that something beneath the surface was no longer as steady as before, and Angela Carter remained exactly where she was, her gaze unwavering, her posture untouched by the tension that now pressed against every corner of the courtroom. And if you were standing there, if you were close enough to feel the weight of that silence settling into your chest, you would have noticed it too. The way her stillness was no longer passive, it was controlled, intentional, as if she was not reacting to the moment, but allowing it to unfold on her terms. And near the side entrance, the door opened a little wider this time, quiet, deliberate, revealing two figures in dark suits who stepped in without announcement, their presence subtle but undeniable, the kind of presence that did not ask for attention, yet commanded it anyway. And one of the deputies near the wall straightened instinctively, his hand moving to adjust his belt, his eyes flicking toward them with a recognition he did not voice, not out loud, not in front of everyone. And Daniel did not turn, not immediately, because he had spent too many years believing that whatever happened in a room like this would always bend in his favor, that whatever authority entered would reinforce his own, and for a few more seconds, he held on to that belief, gripping it tighter than he realized, while Angela finally moved, just a single step forward, measured, calm, the sound of her shoes against the polished floor echoing far louder than it should have. Or maybe the room had simply gone so quiet that even the smallest movement now carried weight, and she reached down, picking up a thin folder that had rested beside her chair, a simple motion, unhurried. But as she straightened, the angle of the overhead lights caught the edge of the seal pressed into the cover, faint but unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for. And one of the men who had just entered paused, his gaze locking onto her with immediate recognition, not surprise, not confusion, but confirmation, as if he had been waiting for this exact moment to arrive. And that was when the shift became impossible to ignore, when the room itself seemed to lean forward, when the quiet turned from uncomfortable to charged, and Daniel finally glanced over his shoulder. Just a quick look, just enough to register that something behind him did not fit the script he had been following. And when his eyes returned to Angela, there was a fraction of a second where his expression faltered, not completely, not enough for anyone to call it out, but enough for it to exist, and Angela met his gaze again, steady as ever, and this time, there was no question in her eyes, no uncertainty, only a calm certainty that felt heavier than any raised voice could have been. And when she spoke, her voice was not loud. It did not need to be, because the room was already listening. Every breath held, every movement paused, waiting for something none of them could yet name, and somewhere deep in that silence, the illusion that had carried Daniel Brooks for years began to crack, not with noise, not with force, but with the quiet, undeniable weight of truth stepping into the room. For a moment, no one moved, not because they were told to stay still, but because something in the air made movement feel inappropriate, like speaking during a moment that demanded silence. And Angela Carter took one more step forward, the folder now held firmly in her hand, her posture unchanged, her expression steady in a way that did not match the tension surrounding her. And the two men who had entered the courtroom continued forward with quiet purpose, their shoes barely making a sound against the polished floor. Yet somehow every step they took seemed to echo louder than anything that had happened before, and one of them gave a subtle nod in Angela's direction, not dramatic, not exaggerated, but unmistakably respectful, and that single gesture did what no raised voice could have done. It shifted the balance of the room in an instant, because respect like that was not given lightly, not in a place like this, not in front of this many people, and Daniel Brooks saw it, even if he did not fully understand it yet. His eyes narrowing slightly as his mind tried to piece together a situation that no longer followed the rules he was used to. And for the first time since he had walked into that courtroom, he did not look in control. He looked uncertain, just for a second, just enough for the illusion to weaken, and Angela stopped at the center of the room, close enough now that there was no distance left to hide behind, no space left for misunderstanding, and she placed the folder down on the table in front of her with a calm, deliberate motion, the soft sound of it touching the surface somehow louder than any argument could have been, and the man to her right stepped forward, reaching into his jacket and removing a small leather wallet, flipping it open just enough for the badge inside to catch the light, not held high, not displayed for drama, just presented with quiet authority. And the shift in the room deepened, spreading from the front rows to the back like a ripple that no one could stop, and a clerk near the bench straightened immediately, her hands pausing mid-motion as her eyes widened slightly, recognition dawning without a single word being spoken, and Daniel's jaw tightened as he glanced from the badge to Angela and back again, his mind racing now, trying to reassert control over a situation that was slipping further away with every passing second. And then Angela finally spoke, her voice even, measured, carrying effortlessly through the silence without needing to rise, and there was no anger in it, no urgency. Just clarity, the kind of clarity that comes from knowing exactly who you are and exactly why you are standing where you are. And she said his name first, not loudly, but precisely, each syllable landing with intention, and that alone was enough to make his shoulders stiffen, because it was not a guess, it was not a question, it was certainty. And then she continued, Not with an accusation, not with a threat, but with something far more unsettling, a statement of fact. And as she spoke, she opened the folder, revealing documents neatly organized, pages marked, signatures visible even from a distance. And though no one in the room could read the details, they did not need to, because the reaction from the people who recognized what they were seeing was enough. The subtle shift of posture, the quiet intake of breath, the way attention snapped into focus all at once, and Daniel felt it, the weight of something larger than him settling into place, pressing down on the confidence he had relied on for years. And for the first time, he did not interrupt, he did not dismiss, he did not step forward. He stood still, watching, waiting, because somewhere deep down, he understood that whatever was happening now was no longer his to control. And Angela closed the folder again with the same calm precision she had shown from the beginning, lifting her eyes to meet his one last time. And in that moment, the room did not just feel tense, it felt inevitable, like everything that had led up to this point had been building quietly, patiently, waiting for this exact second to reveal itself. And when the man beside her finally spoke, addressing the court with quiet authority, identifying their presence and purpose without raising his voice, it confirmed what the room had already begun to realize, that this was not an interruption, this was an arrival, and the system that had once protected Daniel Brooks was no longer standing behind him, it was standing in front of him, and it had a new face. The words settled into the room like a weight that no one could ignore, not anymore, and for a long second, the only sound was the faint hum of the overhead lights, steady and indifferent, as if the building itself had seen moments like this before and knew better than to react. And Angela Carter did not move. She did not need to, because everything that mattered had already been set into motion. And the man beside her finished speaking with the same quiet authority, his tone controlled, official, leaving no room for interpretation. And that was when the shift became complete, not gradual this time, not subtle, but absolute, because the room no longer saw Angela as just another presence standing at the center of a tense exchange. They saw her for what she was, and more importantly, for what she represented, and Daniel Brooks felt it before he fully understood it. The way the attention around him changed direction, the way the unspoken support he had always relied on simply disappeared, replaced by something colder, something distant, and for the first time, he was not the one defining the atmosphere. He was reacting to it, his shoulders stiff, his posture still upright, but no longer grounded in certainty, and his eyes moved quickly, scanning faces that no longer mirrored his confidence. A deputy near the wall avoided his gaze entirely. A clerk who had once seemed indifferent now watched him with quiet focus. And even the air between him and Angela felt different. Heavier, like the space itself had taken sides. And Angela finally reached for the folder again, opening it just enough to slide a single document forward across the table, not aggressively, not with force, just a calm, deliberate gesture, and the paper came to rest within his view, its edges perfectly aligned, its presence undeniable. And Daniel hesitated, just for a moment, before looking down, because part of him still believed this was something he could dismiss, something he could control, with the same confidence he had used countless times before. But that belief was already cracking, and as his eyes scanned the page, the details began to register, not all at once, not in a dramatic realization, but piece by piece. Each line adding weight to the next, each signature reinforcing what he did not want to accept. And behind him, the courtroom door opened fully now, no longer cautious, no longer subtle. An additional officials stepped inside, their presence quiet but unmistakable, forming a perimeter not through force but through position, through intent. And the judge entered shortly after, his usual composure slightly altered, his steps slower, more deliberate, as he took in the scene that had unfolded in his absence. And for a brief second, his eyes met Angela's. And there was recognition there, not surprise, but acknowledgement. And that single exchange confirmed what the room had already begun to understand, that this was not an interruption to the system. This was the system correcting itself. And Daniel straightened instinctively as the judge approached the bench, but the movement lacked the certainty it once carried. Because authority no longer flowed in his direction, it had shifted, realigned, and now stood firmly across from him, embodied in the woman he had underestimated just moments ago. and Angela closed the folder once more, her hands resting lightly on its surface, her expression unchanged, calm, composed, but now undeniably authoritative, and when she spoke again, her voice carried not just through the room but through the silence that had settled into every corner of it, steady and clear, and there was no need to raise it, because every person present was already listening, not out of curiosity, not out of obligation, but out of understanding that what was being said now mattered, and Daniel felt it in the stillness around him, in the absence of support, in the quiet certainty that had replaced his confidence, and for the first time, he did not interrupt, he did not challenge, he simply stood there, facing the reality that had arrived without warning but with undeniable clarity, and in that moment, it was no longer about what had happened minutes ago. It was about what had always been there, hidden beneath assumptions, waiting for the right moment to be revealed, and that moment had finally come. The room did not erupt, it did not fill with noise or chaos. Instead it settled into something far more powerful, a controlled stillness that made every movement feel significant, every breath noticeable, and Angela Carter stood at the center of it with the same quiet composure she had carried from the very beginning, as if nothing about this moment surprised her, as if this outcome had been inevitable long before anyone else in the room had even realized there was something unfolding, and the judge adjusted his glasses slightly as he took his seat, his gaze sweeping across the courtroom before returning to Angela, not with authority over her, but with a recognition of authority beside him, and that subtle distinction did not go unnoticed, especially not by Daniel Brooks, who remained standing exactly where he had been. Though everything about his stance had changed, the confidence that once filled his posture now replaced with a stiffness that came from uncertainty rather than control, and his eyes moved again, searching for something familiar, some signal that this was still within his grasp. But there was nothing, no nods of agreement, no shared glances, no unspoken reinforcement from the system he had relied on for years, and that absence spoke louder than anything anyone could have said. And Angela finally lifted the document from the table, holding it just enough for the judge to see, her movement precise, deliberate, and when she spoke, her voice carried with the same calm authority, but now it held something more, not emotion, not anger, but finality, the kind that leaves no room for debate, and she outlined, briefly and clearly, the purpose of her presence, the scope of the review that had been underway, the oversight that had been authorized at the highest levels, and as she spoke, the words did not feel like an explanation. They felt like a conclusion, as if everything she was saying had already been decided long before this moment. And Daniel listened, not because he wanted to, but because he had no choice, because the room itself had shifted into a place where ignoring her was no longer possible. And as the details unfolded, small but significant, the timeline, the documentation, the internal reports that had quietly accumulated over months, the weight of it began to settle, not just on him, but on everyone present, because this was no longer about a single moment in a courtroom. It was about a pattern, a structure, something deeper that had been observed, recorded, and now brought into the light. And one of the officials stepped forward slightly, his presence reinforcing what Angela had already made clear, and the judge nodded once, slowly, acknowledging the process that had now taken precedence over everything else in the room. And for the first time, Daniel's shoulders lowered just a fraction, not in surrender, not yet, but in recognition that whatever control he believed he had was no longer his to hold. And Angela closed the document again, her hands steady, her gaze returning to him, and there was no triumph in her expression, no satisfaction, only a quiet certainty that what needed to happen was already happening. And that was what made the moment heavier than anything else, because it was not driven by emotion, it was driven by truth, and truth did not need to raise its voice to be heard. And somewhere in the back of the room, someone exhaled slowly, as if they had been holding their breath for far too long, and that single breath seemed to ripple outward, releasing the tension just enough for reality to fully settle in. And Angela spoke one final sentence, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. And as the words reached the edges of the room, the illusion that had once surrounded Daniel Brooks did not shatter with force, it dissolved, quietly, completely, leaving behind only what had always been there, waiting to be seen. No one spoke immediately after her final sentence. Not because there was nothing to say, but because anything spoken too soon would have felt out of place, like interrupting something that needed to settle fully before it could be understood, and Angela Carter did not rush the moment. She did not repeat herself. She did not look around for validation. She simply allowed the silence to do what it always does when truth has already been established. It forced everyone in the room to confront it, on their own terms, and the judge leaned back slightly in his chair, his fingers resting against the edge of the bench as his eyes moved once more between Angela and the officials now positioned around the room, and with a slow, deliberate motion, he reached for his gavel, not to command order, but to acknowledge that order had already been redefined, and the soft sound it made against the wood was not loud. Yet it carried through the courtroom with a clarity that marked the transition from uncertainty to process, and Daniel Brooks felt it in that moment. The shift from perception to reality. The exact second where everything he had relied on became something he could no longer access. And he inhaled slowly, as if trying to steady himself, but the breath did not bring back the control he was used to. It only made him more aware of how much had changed, and one of the officials stepped closer now, not abruptly, not forcefully, but with a calm intention that left no room for misunderstanding, and Daniel's eyes followed the movement, his posture tightening again. But this time it was not rooted in authority, it was rooted in awareness, in the realization that the roles in this room had been rewritten without his permission, and Angela watched him, not with judgment, not with satisfaction, but with a steady clarity that reflected exactly what this moment represented. And for the first time since this began, Daniel spoke, his voice lower than before, measured, controlled, but lacking the certainty it once carried. And though his words were brief, they revealed something deeper than any argument could have. They revealed that he was trying to understand what had happened, how everything had shifted so completely in such a short amount of time. And Angela did not interrupt him. She let him finish, because this was not about silencing him. It was about allowing the reality of the situation to stand on its own. And when she responded, her voice remained calm, even, but there was a weight behind it now, not emotional, but factual, and she clarified what had already been set into motion, the review, the authority behind it, the process that would follow, and as she spoke, the words did not feel like an escalation. They felt like a continuation, as if this moment was simply one step in something much larger that had been unfolding long before today, and the officials around them maintained their positions, not as enforcers, but as witnesses to a transition that had already been decided. And Daniel's shoulders lowered again, this time not just slightly, but enough to show that the resistance he had been holding on to was no longer sustainable, and his gaze dropped briefly to the document on the table before returning to Angela. And in that glance, there was something new, not agreement, not acceptance, but recognition, the kind that comes when a person realizes that the version of reality they believed in is no longer the one they are standing in. And the courtroom remained quiet, not tense anymore, but settled, as if everything that needed to happen had already begun. And Angela took a small step back, not retreating, not stepping away from authority, but repositioning herself within it, fully, completely. And as the judge spoke again, formally acknowledging the proceedings that would now take place, the room responded not with surprise, not with confusion, but with a quiet understanding that the moment of uncertainty had passed, and what remained was something far more powerful, something structured, something undeniable. And as Daniel stood there, no longer at the center of control, but at the center of consequence, the truth that had entered the room earlier did not fade. It remained, steady and unshaken, because once it had been seen, it could not be unseen, and once it had been acknowledged, it could not be undone. The courtroom did not return to normal, because there was no normal left to return to, only a new reality settling into place piece by piece. And as the judge's voice carried through the room outlining the next procedural steps, it sounded less like a command and more like an acknowledgement of something that had already taken hold. And Angela Carter remained steady, her presence no longer questioned, no longer observed with uncertainty, but accepted with a quiet, collective understanding that she now defined the space she stood in, and the officials positioned around the room did not need to move much, their stillness alone reinforcing the shift that had taken place. and Daniel Brooks stood there absorbing it all, not resisting anymore, not challenging, but processing, his mind moving through the fragments of what had just unfolded, trying to connect moments that no longer aligned the way he remembered them. And for the first time, the weight of the room did not feel like something he could push against. It felt like something he had to stand within, and the difference was undeniable. And as the judge finished speaking, a clerk stepped forward quietly, placing additional documents on the bench, her movements precise, respectful, reflecting the tone that now governed the entire courtroom. And the subtle choreography of the system began to reveal itself, not chaotic, not aggressive, but structured, intentional. And Daniel watched it happen, watched how easily the environment adapted once the truth had been acknowledged, and it struck him, perhaps for the first time, that control had never been as permanent as he believed. It had simply gone unchallenged, and Angela took a slow breath, not out of relief, not out of tension, but as a natural pause in a process she clearly understood, and she turned slightly, addressing the officials beside her with a few quiet words that carried just enough for those closest to hear, confirming the next steps, the coordination that would follow, and every movement that came after felt aligned, synchronized, as if each person in that room now understood their role without needing instruction. And Daniel's gaze lowered again, not in defeat, but in reflection, his eyes briefly landing on the polished surface of the table where the document still rested, and for a moment, the room around him seemed to fade, replaced by a realization that extended far beyond this single courtroom, beyond this single day, because what he was facing was not just a consequence. It was a shift in perspective, a moment where the narrative he had relied on no longer held together. And when he looked back up, his expression had changed, not dramatically, not in a way that drew attention, but in a way that marked the beginning of understanding. And Angela met his gaze once more, not holding it for long, just enough to acknowledge that the moment had reached its natural conclusion. And then she turned her attention back to the process unfolding around her, because this was never about a single interaction. It was about restoring something that had been overlooked, something that required more than one moment to correct. And as the officials began to reposition, preparing to move forward with the formal procedures now in place, the courtroom itself seemed to exhale, not in relief, but in acceptance. And the tension that had once filled the space did not disappear. It transformed, becoming something steadier, something grounded. And Daniel remained where he was for a second longer than necessary, as if allowing himself one final moment to stand in what had just happened before stepping into what came next. And when he finally moved, it was not with the authority he once carried, but with an awareness that had not been there before. And Angela, now fully established in the role that had always been hers, did not look back, because she did not need to. The moment had already spoken for itself, and the truth that had entered that room had not only changed the outcome, it had changed the understanding of everyone who witnessed it, leaving behind a silence that was no longer uncertain, but resolved. The movement that followed was not rushed, not chaotic, but deliberate, as if every person in that courtroom understood that what had just occurred required precision, not reaction. And Angela Carter walked with that same steady composure, her steps measured, her presence no longer questioned by anyone who witnessed it. And the officials beside her adjusted their positions with quiet coordination, creating a flow that guided the next phase forward without needing to announce it. And Daniel Brooks, now no longer at the center of authority but still at the center of attention, became aware of something he had never fully experienced before, the absence of assumption, the removal of automatic deference, and in its place, a clear and structured process that did not bend, did not pause, did not look to him for direction. And that realization settled deeper than anything else, because it was not loud, it was not dramatic, it was simply undeniable. And as he took a small step to the side, allowing space where he once would have occupied it without question, the shift became visible to everyone, not as a moment of defeat, but as a moment of redefinition. And the courtroom itself seemed to follow that shift, the murmurs that had once hovered at the edges now gone, replaced by a focused quiet that carried a different kind of weight, the kind that comes when people recognize that they are witnessing something that will be remembered long after the room empties. And Angela paused briefly near the front, turning slightly as one of the officials spoke to her in a low voice, confirming details, timelines, procedures. and she responded with clarity, not needing to assert herself, because authority had already been established through action, through presence, through the undeniable alignment of everything that had unfolded. And across the room, a few individuals exchanged glances, not of confusion, but of realization, as if connecting pieces that had never quite fit together before, and the judge observed it all with a composed expression, his role now shifting into one of facilitation rather than control, acknowledging that the system he represented was not being challenged, but corrected. And Daniel remained still for a moment longer, his eyes following the movement around him. And there was something different in the way he looked now, something quieter, more internal, as if the questions he had once directed outward were now turning inward. And for the first time, he did not seem concerned with how the room saw him, but with how he understood himself within it. And that shift, though subtle, carried more weight than any outward reaction could have. And Angela, having completed what needed to be done in that space, turned toward the exit, not in retreat, not in avoidance, but in continuation, because this moment was never the end. It was a transition into something larger, something that extended beyond the walls of this courtroom. And as she moved, the officials followed in quiet synchronization, their presence no longer a disruption but a natural extension of the order that had been restored. And the door that had once opened cautiously now stood fully accessible, a clear path forward rather than a point of uncertainty. And Daniel watched her for a brief second as she walked past, not with resentment, not with defiance, but with a recognition that did not need to be spoken. And when she passed him, she did not pause. She did not look back, because the moment between them had already reached its conclusion, and the silence that followed her exit was not empty. It was full of understanding, full of reflection, full of a truth that no one in that room could ignore. And as the final footsteps faded beyond the doorway, the courtroom remained still, not because it lacked motion, but because it was absorbing what had just taken place. And in that stillness, one thing became clear to everyone present. Power had not disappeared. It had simply revealed its true form, and it no longer looked the way they once expected. The courtroom did not return to noise after the door closed behind Angela Carter. It remained quiet in a way that felt different now, not tense, not uncertain, but reflective, as if every person still seated there was processing something they had not expected to witness. And the judge adjusted the papers in front of him with slow, deliberate movements, no longer rushing to the next case, no longer eager to move past what had just happened, because some moments could not be skipped. They had to be absorbed. And Daniel Brooks stood where he was, no longer the focal point, no longer the force that shaped the room, but still present within it. And for the first time, his presence did not command attention. It existed within the same structure as everyone else, equal to the process, subject to it. And that realization settled deeper than anything spoken aloud, because it did not come from accusation. It came from understanding. And around him, people began to shift in their seats, not with discomfort, but with a quiet awareness that something had changed, not just in the room, but in the way they would remember it, the way they would talk about it later, the way it would stay with them longer than they expected. And Daniel took a slow breath, his gaze moving across the courtroom one more time. But this time he was not searching for support. He was observing, taking in the details he had overlooked before, the expressions, the distance, the subtle cues that had always been there, but had never required his attention until now. And it was in those small details that the full weight of the moment finally settled, because what had happened was not sudden, it was not random. It was the result of something that had been building quietly, patiently, waiting for the right moment to be seen. And that moment had arrived without needing force, without needing volume. It had arrived through presence, through truth, through a clarity that could not be ignored once it was revealed. And the judge's voice broke the silence again, calm and steady, calling the room back into motion. But even as the next steps were announced, the atmosphere did not fully reset. It carried forward what had just been established, embedding it into everything that followed. And Daniel straightened slightly, not out of habit, not out of authority, but out of acknowledgement, as if aligning himself with the structure he had once believed he controlled. And for a brief second, he closed his eyes, not in defeat, but in recognition, because the moment had already passed, and what remained was its meaning. And across the room, a few Quiet conversations began to form, low voices, careful words, each person interpreting the experience in their own way, but all of them connected by the same understanding that what they had seen was not just an event, it was a correction, a reminder, a shift that redefined what power looked like when it was no longer assumed. And as the courtroom slowly resumed its function, the memory of Angela's presence did not fade. It remained, not as a disruption, but as a standard, something that would shape how this space was experienced long after she had left. And Daniel opened his eyes again, his expression calm, but changed, and in that change, there was no need for words, because the lesson had already been delivered, not through confrontation, not through force, but through something far more lasting, the quiet, undeniable realization that authority is not proven by how loudly it is used, but by how clearly it stands when it is finally revealed. And in that realization, the courtroom moved forward, but it did not forget.